Euphrasie Barbier. Chapter 4, 1852, London Days. It was a frightening time for Sister Mary and Mother St. Raphael. The money they earned was hardly enough to buy their food. They prayed many times every day that they would have the strength to carry on without making serious blunders. They knew their whole community depended on them, but there was so little they could do. They soon found the French chapel, and that was a comfort to them. As often as they could, they would go to Mass very early in the morning. The priest in charge was French too, but they hardly dared speak to him. He observed the two retiring young ladies often at Mass, and wondered about them for several weeks. There was something unusual about them, he thought. Was it their dress, their manner? Then one day he blurted out, "You aren't religious sisters, are you?" "You are sisters? Why ever didn't you tell me? Where have you come from? What are you doing here?" They told him the whole story then. "But we cannot go to Father Philpin's friend," they said. "We cannot take the letter and ask for help from him when he is having such trouble himself." "A letter for Father Delgarin," he said, and he laughed. "Father Delgarin can look after himself very well. Don't worry about him. He'll be glad to hear about you. I'll get in touch with him immediately." Mother St. Raphael and Sister Mary were agreeably surprised when they finally met Father Philpin's elderly English priest. He was robust, cheerful, and friendly. He spoke French fluently and welcomed them warmly. "Is there any help I can give you, sisters?" he asked. "Anything? Transport? Your house? Friends to assist you?" They confessed that they were worried most by the house. 3 more sisters were due to arrive from Couve any day, and they simply couldn't fit into the room at the Morels. With encouragement and practical help from their new friends, Mother St. Raphael and Sister Mary rented a modest apartment not far away. The 5 sisters soon made the new place neat and homelike. They hung up the crucifix and pictures, set a fire in the grate, and arranged their cheap, worn furniture. They now owned a table and several odd chairs, but nothing else. Some empty boxes served for closets and drawers. For beds they got some cheap, strong ticking and stitched up large bags. Stuffed with fresh straw, they made good mattresses to spread on the floor. With several second-hand blankets and some hasty patchwork, they made covers for their beds. They were not particularly warm or comfortable, but the sisters were delighted with them. Every morning the 5 mattresses were stacked in a corner with the blankets neatly folded on top, and the room stood cleared for work. There was plenty of sewing to do, more than enough to keep them busy all day and far into the night. But it was poorly paid, and they now had 5 people to feed and warm. They divided up the food as fairly as they could, and tried to make it last as long as possible. Often they went to bed restless with hunger, but no one would ever complain. They were now missionaries upon their journey, and their mission was to go where God called them, no matter what it cost. Kind Madame Lecomte often called in to keep a sharp motherly eye on her new friends. She suspected that the sisters were short of food and money, and one day she went to Father Delgarin. "I think they are half starved, Father," she said. Have you noticed how white and cold they're looking, even the little rosy-cheeked one?" Father Del Guerin was aghast at his thoughtlessness. He went to a good friend, a wealthy woman who generously supported the church. She was English and of a noble family who had been faithful Catholics for generations, even in the times when Catholics were punished severely for their religion. "You're a woman," he said to this kind lady. "You would notice things. Will you go and see what they need?" The next day, while the sisters were eating their meagre lunch, they were startled by a knock at the door. A well-dressed, middle-aged woman stood there, attended by a liveried servant. He announced her as the Duchess of Norfolk. The sisters were abashed, but Mother St. Raphael quickly collected her wits and stepped forward to greet the noble visitor. The Duchess spoke graciously to the sisters, welcoming them to England. She begged to be allowed to see their house. She was shocked to see how poor it was. "Straw mattresses," she thought. "I didn't know that anyone slept on straw these days." She tried to be polite, gracious, not causing embarrassment to the sisters standing around awkwardly. Her glance took in the table from which they'd risen. Cheap bread and weak black coffee, she noted, and that for their midday meal. Aloud she said, "Please, sisters, pray for me and my family, and do let me help you a little for the good of my soul." Not long after she left, a messenger arrived with a basket heaped with provisions. A piece of fresh beef, vegetables, fruit, and even a nice piece of cake, a treat the sisters had not seen for a long time. For the first time in months they had a nourishing meal, and there was food enough left for several more meals. A few days later, a great cart rumbled down the street and stopped at the sisters' front door to unload 5 real beds, a gift from the Norfolk's mansion at Arundel. The sisters felt strengthened and encouraged. "God has been testing us hard," they said, "but see, if we seek to do His will, He will never let us down." Marylebone was a poor area of the city, and most of their neighbours were no better off than the sisters. The Duchess of Norfolk was a kind and generous woman, but, like most people who had never had to worry where their next meal was coming from, she had no idea how harsh life could be in the poorer areas of London, and she never realised how poor the sisters actually were. They could never let up in their grinding work. Not only were their hands never idle, their minds too were busy trying to pick up the English language. Without it, they could not understand or be understood by any of their neighbours apart from their French-speaking friends. While their hands toiled, they tried to practice the strange sounds and words and to remember useful phrases. For a raw beginner, Euphrasie was making good progress in the language, perhaps better than most of the sisters, but one day she felt completely disheartened. Her head was throbbing and her eyes would not focus properly. Even her throat seemed sore. Most days she and the sisters would have joked, "See, even my head is wearing out, and my throat. Such words! How can I get them into my poor brain, or out again when I need them?" But today, Euphrasie was fighting to hold back tears. She was so cold that her hands were shaking. Her head would work no more than her hands. She was ashamed of her weakness and cowardice. She reminded herself of the harsh penances done by great saints, penances which the spiritual masters said were indispensable for those who genuinely wished to grow in the love of God. As a young sister, she was not yet allowed to perform severe penances herself. A little hunger, a little cold, a headache, and here I am, whimpering like a child. Oh Jesus, how can I be so ungrateful, so selfish? Help me to. She wiped her eyes furtively, but the tears would not stop running. Sister Mari! Mother St. Raphael was calling, but her voice sounded distant. Sister Mari, what is the matter? Are you ill? Mother St. Raphael's cool hand rested against Euphrasie's cheek. Sister, come. You feel very feverish to me. The day is cold, but your face is burning. The sisters dragged a mattress into the small room where Mother St. Raphael usually slept, and made up a bed for Euphrasie. With Mother St. Raphael's help, she undressed and crept into it. How cold it felt! Her whole body was shaking now, and she had a raging headache. When Mother St. Raphael returned with a hot drink, Euphrasie could hardly bear to lift her head from the pillow. Try to drink it, sister dear, do try, urged Mother St. Raphael. Then you must sleep. We must take good care of our health. We cannot afford to have illness sapping our strength when God is calling us to serve His church. Mother St. Raphael hung a sheet soaked in carbolic over the door to Euphrasie's room. Don't come near me, sisters, she said. Please fetch Sister Mari's things and leave them here by the door. She has a nasty fever, and we must take strict quarantine precautions until her illness declares itself. I ask just one of you to come with me. Better to be sure than sorry. Euphrasie tried to pray, but she could not remember what was happening. She had vague dreams of crying out, of trying to get up, of terrifying travels among strange people and places, of struggling to get away from the burning heat of her bed. In fact, for many days Euphrasie had no idea at all of what was really happening. The two nurses took turns at sitting beside her. They would allow no one else into the sick room. Within a few days they all realized how wise Mother St. Raphael had been. Euphrasie was suffering from the worst of all fevers. She had smallpox. The sisters were horrified. Smallpox often killed its victims after days of fever and delirium. Those who survived the crisis had a slow and painful recovery. Their skin, pitted all over with open, festering sores, was intensely irritable. Good nurses tried desperately to keep their patients from scratching at the unbearable itchiness and further damaging the broken skin. But even with the best of care and final recovery, smallpox usually had one fearful result. Its victim was left scarred and horribly disfigured for life. For days, Euphrasie hung between life and death. The sisters dared not get a doctor. With their earnings now smaller than ever, they had no money to get the things that richer people would have considered absolutely necessary: a doctor, an experienced nurse, a heated room, medicines for the fever, soothing lotions for the broken skin, cooling drinks. The eruptions on Euphrasie's skin were comparatively slight, but that was not considered a good sign. If the pox did not come out, as people said, it was likely to cause severe internal complications. One day, Euphrasie's fever began to ease. For days she had had nothing to eat or drink but warm water. She was too weak to sit up, but she seemed to recognize her nurses and even smiled at them. Mother St. Raphael slipped out through the door and called the other sisters, waving to them to keep their distance. "She has woken from the fever," she said. "Please count out all the money in the purse. Is there enough to get a little milk and some sugar? She must have something nourishing." While one stirred up the fire to boil the kettle, the others hurried to the grocery to fetch milk, sugar, and some fresh bread. They poured boiling water into a little milk and stirred a small spoonful of sugar into it, that Euphrasie was allowed to drink, but anything more solid she could not keep down. It was days before she could swallow a little bread soaked in the milk and water. Slowly she began to mend. The quarantine curtain was taken down. She was able to see her other sisters once more, and was allowed to sit with them for a short time each day. As she started to regain her strength, she began to pick up her sewing and her study again. For a long time, though, she could not eat with the sisters. Her stomach would not settle down, and she was acutely embarrassed by the way it would reject food without warning. Until it became more predictable, she was forced to eat and drink only in private. The sisters talked of their plans for the future. "Sister Mari, you can speak English now," they said. "It is time we started some classes. We could teach all kinds of needlework. And what about reading and writing for children? There are no schools in this part of London." Euphrasie agreed. She knew little enough English, she realized, but if they waited until their English was perfect, they would never start. With a little rearrangement of the household, the sisters cleared and prepared one room, and classes began. A small needlework class and an even smaller school. Back in Couve, the Sisters of Calvary were having a bad time. Even their free school had few pupils. They had taken in no more novices, but now they had no money to support the sisters they had. The final blow in the series of disasters was the death of their old bishop, who had always been kind and encouraging. The new bishop had no time for unsuccessful religious communities. "Close the school, Father Philpin," he ordered. "Disband your sisters. Send them home to their families or take them to another diocese. I do not want them here." Father Philpin was stunned. Then he began to think. Maybe this is not the end. Maybe this is all God's plan. Perhaps we just have to move faster than we think possible. He put the hermitage and all the convent property on the market and put a choice before the sisters. "If you wish to remain Sisters of Calvary and stay with your missionary vocation, you will need to join our sisters already in London. If any of you do not want to leave France, I shall help you find another community to join, or arrange for you to return decently to your families." The sisters soon made their decisions. The property sold quickly too. Father Philpin had asked a bargain price to make a quick sale, but he still made enough money to provide for each of the sisters. Mother St. John and 16 of the 35 sisters decided to go to London. Father Philpin paid their fares and saw them off. He would meet them in London later when he had finished all their business in France. There was a tremendous upheaval in the Calvary Sisters London community. 22 sisters were now jammed into an apartment barely large enough to house 5. It was to be only for a short time, though, Mother St. John assured everyone. Tomorrow I go looking for a bigger house, a permanent home for us, where we can live in a real convent again, she said, and everyone was very happy in spite of the crowding and inconvenience. The sisters were delighted to be together again. They settled into a routine of work and prayer and began to plan for their future now that they had some money from the sale of the Couve property. One day, urged on by the Oratorian fathers, they even decided to wear their habits in public. "Everyone around here now knows we are sisters," they said. "What is there to fear? The local people may be poor, but they are polite and friendly." Still, the first time out was something of an ordeal. In this country, where nuns' habits hadn't been seen for hundreds of years, the first sight of them caused something of a sensation. One horse tram slowed to a stop in the middle of the street to let the passengers gaze at the novelty. Some of their friends even raised a cheer for them. Still flushed with embarrassment, one of the pioneer sisters reported the incident when she got home. "Calling and whistling and shouting they were, all those boys," she said, and then she laughed. But it was all in English, so cheering or jeering, it was all the same. We didn't know what they were saying. The sisters now went out and about freely, and no harm came to them, though sometimes cheeky urchins called out rude words and laughed, and a few religious fanatics tried to stir up prejudice against the Papists. People began to trust and love the sisters. They no longer needed to look for work. Work came looking for them, it seemed. In a poor part of London, a group of priests had set up a church and mission called the Oratory, and then a day school for boys. So many people wanted education for their children that the father's school was soon swamped by small boys. To Father Faber, the leader of the Oratorian Fathers, the newly arrived Sisters of Calvary were an answer to prayer. "We'll set up a school for girls here now," he said, "and later another school over there, and then more schools, a refuge, refuges, workrooms." Mother St. John was a little more cautious. She saw that her sisters could easily be exhausted by the endless demands. They had good friends helping them, English as well as French, but they were stretched to capacity. Among many friendly English people, they had met 3 young ladies, recent converts to the church. Miss Elizabeth Nutt and her 2 younger sisters were well-to-do and well-educated. They helped the sisters devotedly, spending hours and teaching them to speak English well. When Father Philpin arrived from France, he stayed with the Nutt family for some time, and he too joined the language classes. The sisters soon moved into a larger house, as Mother St. John had promised. In the new year they moved again, this time to a much larger and more convenient place, which they thought of as their permanent home. London was a booming city, the hub of the British Empire. Mother Raphael and Sister Mary had arrived at the time of the Great Exhibition. The Crystal Palace was a triumph of engineering. It was a huge glass building erected as showplace to display thousands of the world's most modern inventions, weird and wonderful. London was served by the efficient Metropolitan Omnibus Company, and people poured into the exhibition. The whole population of London, wrote an enthusiastic newspaper reporter, marvelling at the wonderful developments promised by the new technology. There was even one well-to-do part of the city where experimental electric street lighting was working. But this was not the London that the sisters and their neighbours knew. Their London was narrow alleys and dirt and hunger. The city authorities had just started work on the street water supply, for water was not laid on to individual houses yet, and certain doctors had long been protesting that London's frequent outbreaks of cholera and typhoid fever came from polluted water sources. Upgrading of the city's primitive sewerage system was still only in the planning stages, and the Thames was so dirty that in warm weather it was nicknamed the Great Stink. Ragged children scavenged the slimy banks for empty bottles and any kind of sellable junk. Mudlarks, people called them. Within weeks, the sisters' new school had more than 100 little girls in it, many of them ragged and half-starved. The sisters had to find warm clothing and food for them before they could benefit from their lessons. They begged for clothes and anything which could be spared to help those in hardship. They sorted and mended and knitted and sewed for their little sales table. They opened an industrial school to teach crafts and needlework to women and older girls. Many young children had to work for their living during daylight hours. The harsh life of London's slums dragged many of them into crime just to survive physically. For these children especially, the sisters opened a night school, and it was soon packed to the doors. When the fathers preached a mission, it was the sisters who gathered in the local women, made them welcome, and instructed them in the large hall of the girls' school. Euphrasie was busy all day and a good part of the night. "Sister Mary! Sister Mary!" the young Cockney voices called, and Euphrasie smiled to hear her English name. Some months later, when the sisters were becoming well known in London, they decided to change the name of their congregation from Sisters of Calvary to something more easily understood by a largely non-Catholic population. Sisters of Mercy was a title they particularly liked, but it was already taken by an Irish congregation. Sisters of Compassion seemed to express the loving care of the church for anyone in need, so Sisters of Compassion they became. Every day, more and more people called upon them for help. The sisters themselves began to multiply too. The Protestant England they had once feared was now bringing good vocations to their novitiate, mostly young girls of devout Irish backgrounds, but sometimes young English women as well. Mother St. John found herself overwhelmed with responsibilities and decided that she must have an assistant. She chose the busy and capable Sister Mary as her deputy and new novice mistress. Euphrasie was still very thin and eating next to nothing, but she did more than a full day's work. How she managed to be so lively was a puzzle to Mother St. John, but Reverend Mother's confidence in her was not disappointed. The young novices loved their new mistress too, but they were not Euphrasie's only responsibility. For a short time she took charge of the girls' school while the headmistress was sick. She did the job well, but she realised how urgently the community needed more fully qualified teachers. With 5 other young sisters, she began to study for the necessary examinations. They coached each other in every spare moment of their busy days and evenings. Late in the year, the 6 of them went to Liverpool to spend 6 weeks in the new normal school and training college of the Sisters of Notre Dame. The weeks of cramming and practical work ended with 10 days of written examinations in many different subjects. The 6 students were home again in London for Christmas, and in the new year the mail brought their reward, a teacher's certificate for each of them. It was a worthwhile return for the hard work, not only of the last few months, but also of those earlier days when they had struggled so hard just to learn a little English. Euphrasie thought often of Jesus saying, "The fields are white with harvest, but the labourers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest." Yes, and that is London only, she thought. What about all of England? What about the foreign missions still waiting for us? Mother St. John took Euphrasie with her to consult Father Philpin. "We have had a few vocations here in England," she said, "but our sisters are always overloaded. Think of the religious vocations that come from France. So many good girls in Catholic Normandy, so many longing to give themselves to our Lord and His work. But how would they ever know of us over here, waiting for them?" "Ah, Mother, are you suggesting that I go looking for recruits for you over in France?" His eyes twinkled. "Well, of course, that is what Father Chantom, our founder, did. We'd never have started without him. Well, maybe I should. Maybe this coming summer I could go." Euphrasie wrote promptly to her family in Caen to prepare them for Father Philpin's visit, for the Barbier family had never lost contact with their young missionary, and the whole family cherished every item of news from Euphrasie. A few weeks later she had to send another important note. Adele had found a way of sending a little practical help to the daughter so far from home. "Thank you very much, dear Mamma, for the case of fruit you so kindly sent. Next time, do not bother to send the very small apples which you put on top, so the good ones would not be stolen. All arrived safely packed in the straw, just as you had arranged them." She added, "I made a mistake in telling you that Father Philpin would stay a few days with you. He will only visit you." Hastily she took out another paper and began to write apologetically to Father Lafournier, her old friend and adviser. "I am afraid you will hardly remember me, for I have not written to you for nearly 7 years." She explained the purpose of Father Philpin's visit to Caen. "He is practically our founder," she added, "and he will tell you all about our congregation. I am sure you will be a great help to him and to us." But when summer came, it was Sister Marie herself who went to Normandy. The Barbiers were delighted. It was exactly 10 years since Euphrasie had left home. She stayed with her parents for nearly a month. Louis was 19 now, the age Euphrasie had been when he last saw her. Now a shy and awkward young man, he was so overawed by this revered stranger that he could hardly speak to her. The baby Marie, now a teenager, gazed at her sister in similar awe. Even Naomi found it hard to talk naturally to the sister who had been away so long. Naomi had had profound experiences too. She had married a likeable but thriftless young man of indifferent health, and now had a precious little boy of her own. But Euphrasie now seemed so much older and wiser than any of the family that Naomi could not bring herself to confide in this holy stranger. It was only Louis and Adele who could see the old Euphrasie sitting once more among their children, and even they marvelled at the things she told them. Father Le Fournier was delighted to see Euphrasie again. Older and stooped and grey though he was now, he went out of his way to help her. He directed her here and there, invited her in to address church groups in his own parish, and took her to visit other convents. Sister Marie's efforts were fruitful. When she prepared to return to London, 7 girls were ready to leave with her immediately. Others who were thinking over their vocation promised to join her later, when they were more sure of what God was asking. Back in London, Euphrasie settled down to her usual tasks, and the new postulants began to settle into convent life. Mother St. John was immensely relieved to have her assistant back. "Poor child," she said, "I scold her and order her about all the time, but I cannot manage without her." Mother St. John's load was heavy. Hers was the ultimate responsibility for her congregation and for her sisters' parish works. Now she was trying to build a whole new convent, St. Wilfrid's, large enough for their many needs. Besides managing the novitiate, Sister Marie was always busy trying to raise funds and collect goods for the sisters' welfare work. They had some good friends who were wealthy, but, like the Duchess of Norfolk, who still helped generously from time to time, the rich tended to forget that poverty does not go away with the first or second or 10th gift. It was Euphrasie's job to do the begging rounds to remind them. "Sister Mary, Sister Torment," they called her, laughing at her playful teasing, and her efforts were almost always fruitful. "Nothing? Nothing today?" she'd say. "Then I'd better feed my poor people with this little trifle." And she'd pretend to take away some valuable ornament from the mantelpiece, or what not. "Ah, Sister Mary, there's no escape from you," they would chuckle, and out would come another donation, large or small. It was tiring and delicate work, and Euphrasie learned to understand both rich and poor. Her kindly insistence inspired a number of rich ladies and their young daughters to form their own group dedicated to works of charity. But things did not always go well. Among rich and poor alike, there were people who were jealous or spiteful or lazy or self-seeking. Sister Marie the missionary had no illusions about human nature in other people or in herself. Her work was God's work, and its problems were a natural part of a missionary's burden. One problem niggled constantly, the problem which torments all who are moved by the sufferings and neediness of others: the sheer inability to meet all the needs which are crying for relief. All the sisters seemed to be working hour after hour, day and night, week in and week out. There seemed to be no limit to the demands placed upon them. The more good work they did, the more the needs seemed to grow, and in the pressure of work, time for prayer was often whittled away. The Oratorian Fathers soon considered the Sisters of Compassion an essential part of their mission in London. The sisters had surely been sent by God at a providential moment. They were, moreover, a small independent group, affiliated to no strong congregation. Could you not become Sisters of the Oratory permanently dedicated to our mission here in England? Father Faber suggested. You know how much you are needed here. You know the people here. They love and trust you. Your first-hand experience of England and its needs is too precious to waste. Mother St. John was inclined to agree with him. She was sure that the sisters would never want to abandon the works they were already doing. A slight modification of your constitutions is all that is necessary, continued Father Faber. I'd be happy to help you. Euphrasie was horrified. She could not believe that her missionary vocation was to stop here. She did not regret the London years, but to her they had been the time of preparation for her real vocation. But, Mother, our constitutions, the ideals we have had right from the beginning, she protested. How can we let the Oratorian Fathers rewrite them to leave out the very purpose for which we were founded? She argued, she prayed, she listened to Mother St. John's arguments and scoldings. She questioned her own motives again and again. Was she really resisting God's will, and in her willfulness just looking for self-satisfaction? But if the old goals were to be tossed aside now, why had God called her so persistently all her life for the foreign missions? Mother St. John badgered Euphrasie publicly and privately. Alone she questioned herself. Is Sister Mary merely willful? Is she looking for self-satisfaction, ambition? She has never seemed self-centered. She prays. She seems so faithful, so unassuming. Am I the one who is resisting God's will? To Euphrasie she said bluntly, if you are so sure that you are right and we are wrong, why don't you look around for another missionary congregation? Euphrasie was cut to the heart. She didn't know what to do. She was torn between the community, which had been her whole life for more than 10 years, and her sense of vocation. All these years Mother St. John had been her closest friend and adviser, apart from Father Philpin, and right now Father Philpin was away somewhere on the continent. He had been dismissed as the sister's spiritual director. Mother St. John felt torn apart too. She had long depended on Sister Mary as her assistant. But if she cannot support me wholeheartedly, I cannot have her in a position of authority in our community, she thought. On the other hand, it may be that God really is calling her away from us. One evening, just before Christmas, Mother St. John called the whole community together for a public announcement. Briefly, she said, from this evening, Sister Mary of the Heart of Jesus is relieved of her positions of Assistant Superior and Novice Mistress. She offered no explanation and closed the meeting abruptly. Euphrasie had nothing to say. The sisters noticed that she went to the chapel and prayed there for quite a long time. They were totally mystified. Some wondered if perhaps Sister Mary had disgraced herself in some way, but they couldn't imagine such a thing. Privately, Euphrasie was in torment. Weeks of the new year went by, and she was no nearer reconciling her lifelong sense of calling with the changed direction of her community. She pondered her great longing for deeper prayer. She often found the overactive life of the London community a great hindrance to prayer. Could it be that God was turning her towards a purely contemplative religious life, a hidden life of prayer and sacrifice for God's people, rather than practical help? Should she be looking to the Carmelites, the Poor Clares, another missionary order? But where? She made a few discreet inquiries among several congregations, but outwardly she was working as usual, still busy with the London Mission's social services. One day, an unexpected visitor came to the big new convent of St. Wilfrid's. "I am a missionary, a Marist father," he explained to Mother St. John. "I have heard that the Sisters of Compassion are a missionary congregation." "Reverend Mother, I'm looking for missionary sisters, particularly missionary sisters who speak English, for our missions in New Zealand and the South Pacific." Mother St. John was astounded. She confessed that the Sisters of Compassion were no longer available for the foreign missions. "But will you come back again, Father?" she said. "I may be able to put you in touch with someone who can help you." When Euphrasie returned from work that evening, Mother St. John hurried to tell her the whole story. "Pray, pray, Sister Mary," she said. "This may be the answer you seek." Euphrasie prayed, but she thought carefully around the idea too. "I cannot be a missionary as a sister of compassion," she thought. "Would it be possible for me to leave our congregation without abandoning my vows?" She thought about it. Somehow it seemed wrong to her to leave her vows even for a short time. They were the sign and the reality of her consecration to God. But if it could be done, if I could leave here without leaving my vows, then I would accept that as a sign that God wants me to go. She spoke to the Marist fathers in London, and they discreetly checked on her past history. They were pleased to hear the good reports of the fathers of the oratory. They left Euphrasie in no doubt that they wanted her for the New Zealand mission, but the final decision was to be hers. In May, Sister Mary wrote to the proper authorities in Rome explaining her request. In July, she received a reply giving her permission to enter a new congregation more suited to her vocation. This letter was not a dispensation from her vows, but what is called a change of obedience. Her vows were not cancelled or changed in any way, but she was given permission to live them in a different community. Rather surprisingly, a community which did not exist yet. Euphrasie was convinced now that God was telling her to go ahead. She was both relieved and frightened. Mother St. John was immensely relieved too, now that Euphrasie's future seemed clear. She was sorry to lose such a faithful sister, but she generously gave her all the help she could. "Sister Mary," she asked, "would you like to have a companion in your new venture? Sister Wilfrid, our English novice, is very unsettled. She too feels strongly called to be a missionary. As you know, she is a convert to our faith, and she is also very young. We feel she needs a lot more time for her religious training." So it was that Sister Mary and Sister Wilfrid left the London convent together. At the London Bridge railway station, they met the Marist father who was to accompany them to Paris and introduce them to Father Favre, the leader of the Marists. Though started only 25 years before, the Marist Society had been sending missionaries all that time to the wild islands of the South Pacific. For years they had had little success in their work. Some of their fathers and brothers had even been murdered for their efforts, but at last their patience was beginning to pay off. Now they saw a need for women missionaries to work with women and children. In New Zealand, a Marist bishop, Philippe Viard, had a flourishing mission in a small town called Wellington, and he wanted sisters urgently. Father Favre was delighted to meet the two would-be missionaries, and he accompanied them to his headquarters in Lyon, in the south of France. He took them immediately to a small apartment belonging to the Marist fathers. They noted the address, number 4, Rue Saint Bartholomew. Mother Mary, Sister Wilfrid, here is your new home until Bishop Viard sends for you, he said. It was 15th of August, 1861.